People often think of country music as a popular and commercial music style, usually patriotic and conservative. A lot of modern country is, to me, a bit too polished and far removed from anything that actually feels, well, country. And by that I mean rural or folky, or like my actual lived experience of growing up in the big red middle of the USA, because that experience was not glossy or shiny at all. But there is another side to country music, and you just have to do a little digging in the mud to find it. It's always run just beneath the surface, from country's roots in folk music, to a fascinating scene that sprung up in Colorado, to a range of modern artists who embrace the dark and dramatic in their music, the Gothic side of rural life. That same side that was explored by writers like Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, Cormac McCarthy. Let's explore the Gothic side of country music. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism. Yee-haw! First, I just want to be really clear about something. Gothic country is not goth. It's influenced by the Southern Gothic literary tradition and art tradition, which is a completely separate thing that was around way before goth music. Sometimes it is influenced by post-punk or goth music, but those are some of the corner cases. It's not a necessity of the genre. So if you're down in the comments complaining about these not being goth bands, everybody's gonna know you didn't really watch the video, which means you actually didn't hear me saying this anyway. I'm going to start off by covering a little bit of what I consider proto-Gothic country. Then we're going to move into the actual Gothic country scene, which did spring up in the 80s and 90s. And then we'll talk about some of the bands that have survived to today, or that are even newer bands. So we'll cover a range of things. This is obviously not going to be a complete listing, but it should be enough to get you started in the genre. I also want to thank whoever put together the Swedish Embassy of Gothic Country. This website was invaluable in putting together this video. Instead of bouncing around from dozens of different locations to try and find the information on these bands, this website gave me a huge start in figuring out the details of the scene. So if you want to find out more, I really recommend checking out that website, and I'll include a link to it in the description. And one last thing, there's a lovely playlist to go along with this video on Spotify. You can find a link to that in the description. And there are also playlists to go with all of the other videos on this channel, so check that out as well. From the dawn of country music, there was already a darkness. Why wouldn't there be, with its associations with the plantations of the South, or with the Wild West, both places where life for many could be brutal, terrifying, and short. Leadbelly, a monumental influence on blues, folk, and country, recorded a number of songs you've probably heard more recent versions of by bands like Led Zeppelin and Nirvana. The Gallows Pole is a story of a man about to be hanged. He's hoping someone will come to save them, but as their relatives arrive, they're each showing up just to watch the hanging. He also recorded Black Girl, a song more often called In the Pines, or Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which is full of seemingly disconnected dark imagery. In Draft 1, I wrote about 1,000 words about this song, but I'm gonna save that for a video focused more on just creepy folk songs. Decades after Leadbelly, a man with a penchant for black named Johnny Cash recorded a version of an old folk song called Delia's Gone. The lyrics to this song were based on the true story of the murder of Delia Green, a 14-year-old girl who was shot on Christmas Day in Savannah, Georgia. She was shot by a boy, Moses Houston, who she had apparently been seeing for a few months. The murder itself is described in the song in a matter-of-fact way, with no more emotion in the delivery than any of the other lyrics. First time I shot her in the side. Hard to watch her suffer, but with the second shot she died. Johnny Cash's first version from 1962 doesn't say a word about why he murdered her, despite having apparently considered marrying her. The final verses either show his guilt or some supernatural presence, as he says, "Jailer, oh jailer, jailer I can't sleep, 'cause all around my bedside I hear the patter of Delia's feet." Johnny Cash revisited this song when he was doing his American recordings later in the 90s. This was the first track off of the very first American Recordings album. This version was even more haunting, with an even more dry and deadpan delivery of the lyrics, more details to the murder itself, and a little bit more ambiguous of an ending. Instead of a couple verses that revealed possible guilt in the murderer, there was more of an ethical shrug. If your woman's devilish, you can let her run, or you can bring her down and do her like Delia got done. If you love somebody, set them free, or gun them down. It's a 50-50. While you couldn't consider Cash's whole career an exploration of Gothic country, you could certainly see many of his songs pointing in that direction. suggesting there was room for exploration. Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, was an expert at delivering murder ballads from a perspective that feels genuinely sociopathic. You also have Southern Gothic narratives in songs like Bobby Gentry's masterful Ode to Billy Joe, one of the few perfect songs in the world, the Violent Femmes' Country Death Song, and of course many songs written by Nick Cave, who literally made the album Murder Ballads. But in the late 80s and the early 90s, Gothic country grew into something bigger and more distinct, its actual own music scene. In 1988, alternative rock is moving closer and closer to the mainstream, and the grunge scene is growing in Seattle, Washington. But 1,000 miles away, in the city of Denver, Colorado, another kind of dark music is brewing. A band called the Denver Gentlemen are combining their love of country with their love of bands like Joy Division and Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. This band has passed into legend because, retrospectively, it was a supergroup. Many prominent members of Denver's soon-to-blossom Gothic country scene would come from this one band: Slim Cessna, Munly J. Munly, and David Eugene Edwards. Slim Cessna and Munly J. Munly's careers have remained intertwined ever since, with the two forming a variety of bands with other players from the scene: Slim Cessna's Auto Club, Denver Broncos UK, or DBUK, Munly and the Lee Lewis Harlots, Munly and the Lupercalians, the Blackstone Valley Sinners, Scott Kelly and the Road Home, and even more than that. Slim Cessna's Auto Club has been steadily active ever since, with many good albums. Always Say Please and Thank You and Cypher are both good starting points. However, their newest album, which is called Kinnery of Lupercalia Buell Legion, is beautiful and shows that these guys are aging immaculately, just as good as ever from the music to the songwriting. This album forms part of a trilogy they're in the midst of. From what I've read, they're using this trilogy to explore a fictional set of communities inhabiting an area called Lupercalia. The story and sound of these three cultures are explored, one on each album. The first volume, by Munly and the Lupercalians, was Undelivered Legion. Part 2 is Buell Legion, and the third part will be an album by DBUK, which is yet to be released. For what is possibly the highest point of Munly's songwriting, though, you'll want to hear the only album by Munly and the Lee Lewis Harlots. This has some of his sharpest, darkest lyrics. This is what you might get from a Nick Cave who grew up in a destitute part of Appalachia, and then decided to write murder ballads with an extra helping of religious fervor, incest, and probably the most detailed description of cows doing it you're ever likely to find in country music. I'm not actually an expert of country music, though, so please leave your favorite songs about cow sex in the comments. The Denver Gentlemen also included David Eugene Edwards, and if you've heard of anyone from this scene, it's likely to be him. After leaving the Gentlemen, he formed 16 Horsepower, the band from this whole scene who saw the most commercial success, and gave it a level of worldwide recognition. 16 Horsepower made several excellent albums, before breaking up due to political and spiritual differences. He then formed Woven Hand, who has been making wonderful music ever since. For the next bit, I just want to say I'm not endorsing any of these spiritual views. I actually don't agree with this artist about most things, but I do want to give what I feel like is an authentic commentary on their music, and religion is central to the artist's work. David Eugene Edwards' grandfather was a Nazarene preacher, and throughout his entire career, Edwards has been writing prominently about his Christian belief. There's a fire and brimstone feeling to much of the music by his bands, including 16 Horsepower's most successful single, Black Soul Choir, which includes lyrics like, "Every man is evil, yes, every man's a liar, unashamed with their wicked tongues, singing in the Black Soul Choir." His songwriting merges his religious faith with a darkness that makes that religion feel ominous and often threatening. Edwards has not been shy about discussing his faith in interviews either. He feels neither embraced by Christian music listeners or by the secular music press. For those into Christian music, this isn't a happy, cheerful, cool Jesus that gives out good vibes. This is dark, mournful, more likely to talk about sinners and death than about the glory and the light. No ringing of the golden bells over here. Over here we just have bells tolling. The intensity of the emotion in his music, especially with the band Woven Hand, is incredibly moving. Starting with 16 horsepower though, Sackcloth and Ashes and Low Estate show a version of the Gothic country sound that includes a bit more alternative rock, mixed with the goth, country, folk, and everything else. Both of these are good and maybe the most accessible of all of his work, but I find pretty much everything he's done later more compelling actually. My favorites of the 16 horsepower catalog are the albums Secret South and the live album Live March 2001. Secret South, after its banger of an opener, has the most consistent, melancholy tone of any of the 16 horsepower albums, and maintains a gloomy aesthetic that in a weird way reminds me of something like Faith by The Cure. It's singular in its evocation of a certain unique kind of darkness. Then, the live album captures live renditions of many of the songs from the whole career that I think surpass the studio versions in a lot of cases. With Woven Hand, there are so many good albums. In fact, I can't think of many other current bands this reliable when it comes to putting out high-quality, dark music. Blush Music stands out to me as a high point of their early work. This was composed as the score to a dance performance, but somehow this context actually brought out an even more haunting and emotionally intense sound. And then in their later work, Refractory Obdurate is amazing. Here, along with some of the other more recent Woven Hand albums, the rock elements feel like they're more prominent, yet they're used to build a feeling of oppressive spiritual paranoia that feels completely cohesive with what you've heard on their earlier albums. Woven Hand has 12 studio albums, and I find all of them emotionally moving and beautiful. How many bands have pulled that off? And that's not even counting Edwards' nearly as great work with 16 horsepower. Some people would say it's better. The talent of this man consistently amazes me. But going back to the Denver Gentlemen, the ironic part is, although this band is so legendary for its importance to this Denver scene, there isn't much music to be found now. The band actually revolved around Jeffrey Paul Norlander, who was the steady member as others came and went. During their first run, they had an approach of never playing a song live the same way twice. They formed in 1988, and they lasted until at least 1995 when one of their live performances was recorded. 6 years later, the band was long gone, but the live recording was finally released as Introducing the Denver Gentlemen. Then, following the success of this release, Norlander reformed the band with a new batch of musicians from the scene. They made one self-titled album in 2005, which wasn't as well received, and then they seemed to just fade into the ether again. So I've put a lot of time into talking about the different bands that came out of the Denver Gentlemen, but we're going to spend a little time talking about a couple other bands from the Denver scene, who I think you'll want to check out as well, before we move on. Tarantella. They formed in 2000 in Denver, founded by Cal Cahoon and John Rumley. Cahoon was a classically trained musician who had spent time in Chile and Argentina. The music of Argentina in particular would influence her sound when she arrived in Denver and founded this band, which would have their debut opening for 16 horsepower. Just like you see with a lot of these other Denver bands, the members of Tarantella would hop onto projects by other bands as well. Some of them were performing on some works with Munly, Jay Munly. They performed on his solo album Jimmy Carter Syndrome, and some of them have performed on an album by Lilium as well, which was the band that came out of 16 horsepower from the members that were not David Eugene Edwards. And that band, Lilium, is still going to this day as well, and I wish I had time to talk about them, but I've got a lot to cover. Tarantella's sound is a distinct and enchanting combination of elements, at once Gothic and Tex-Mex, with Spanish flourishes and sometimes a bit of jazz, all with the emotive vocals of Cat Calhoun, delivered in a languorous fashion, often drifting back and forth between English and Spanish. It sounds like it would be a scattered set of influences, but it never feels disjointed or accidental in execution. Their one album, 2005's Escalitos, feels like a lovely journey through some exotic and probably fictional city at night, with the sounds of different musical cultures pouring from the doorways of different nightclubs, somehow complementing one another instead of clashing. Yet the Western flourishes and the dark touches keep the tone of their work within this canon of Gothic Americana. The other Denver band I want to mention is DeVotchKa. This band got their start accompanying burlesque shows and touring with burlesque performer Dita Von Teese. They have a sound that blends country, spaghetti western, Eastern European folk, polka, and even hints of indie rock. The band is full of multi-instrumentalists, including Nick Urata, who sings and plays guitar, bouzouki, piano, trumpet, and theremin. How many country bands do you know that include a theremin? Then you have Jeannie Schroeder, who also sings, plays sousaphone, double bass, and flute. All of them can play wind instruments, 3 of them can play strings as well, and they've got a fucking theremin. How do you compete with that? The Denver scene was their home initially, but they've seen success later in their career through extensive soundtrack work, including the soundtracks to Little Miss Sunshine and I Love You, Philip Morris. Despite having a somberness that feels akin to a lot of these other Gothic country bands, there's also something about the music that reminds me of some other indie music from this time period, some indie rock, but with Eastern European music influencing it as well. So it kind of, at times, reminds me of the band Beirut, if you've heard of them. To get into DeVotchKa, I strongly recommend their album How It Ends. It's an uncategorizable rush of an album that packs in so much emotion and beautiful instrumentation. Songs like How It Ends and You Love Me are beautiful and somewhat traditional in their song structure. But then you have furious explorations of various regional instruments and song stylings on songs like Charlotte Knickknacked and Lanaya Paganka, I don't know. And then you have Menacing Darkness in songs like Viens avec moi. Altogether, it's a rich bounty of musical exploration from a really fucking talented group. There's still quite a few bands making Gothic country. In fact, it seems like it's a bigger genre now than it was even back in the 90s. So we've covered a few that are still around, like Slim Cessna, Woven Hand, and DeVotchKa, but now let's look at a few of the other bands that are still around and making music. A couple bands that are often referred to as Gothic country feel more aligned with psychobilly or even a new Western strain of horror punk. But since Gothic country is already a ridiculous, made-up genre, here are a few bands at this intersection I quite enjoy. First, the Coffin Shakers. This Swedish band formed in 1995 and released their first album, We Are the Undead, in 1999, then followed it up with a self-titled album in 2007, and then we didn't hear anything from them for a long time. Finally, in 2023, they released Graves, Release Your Dead. If you're curious about country psychobilly, some other bands you may want to look into would be Ghoultown and the Dead South. I enjoy this little intersection of genres, but it does move a bit further from feeling genuinely Gothic to me, so I don't want to spend too much time digging into them. A band I do want to dig into is Sons of Perdition. This is essentially the project of Zebulon Whatley, and whoever else happens to be involved at the time. They formed in 2003 in Denton, Texas, and have been active since. Oh my god, this band. This is some dismal, dirge-like country, sometimes played at a speed so slow it feels like you're listening to a 45 RPM record at 33 RPM. Or if you don't know anything about vinyl, it sounds like you're watching a YouTube video on like half speed. It sounds like the batteries are dying on your boombox and the music is grinding slowly to a halt. It sounds like your Victrola is... Okay, I'll stop. Listen to the album The Kingdom is on Fire, their ominous debut. Something about this music makes it feel like you're witnessing some kind of sun-baked and somber tent revival, but it may be a revival of something evil. Compared to pretty much everything else on this list, there is something that feels sort of dark, sinister, and evil coming from this band. And we cannot conclude the topic before talking about the Handsome Family. This husband and wife duo, made up of Rennie and Brett Sparks, formed in Chicago and is now located in Albuquerque. They blend country, bluegrass, and murder ballads, with Rennie writing lyrics and Brett the primary singer. They formed in 2001 and have been going ever since. Their third album, Through the Trees, is often considered their best. This one was recorded with assistance from Jeff Tweedy, who you may know from such bands as Uncle Tupelo and Wilco. They'd become friends with Tweedy, and he allowed them to use a Chicago recording space and some of his own equipment for their third album. For the first time, this meant the Handsome Family weren't being rushed by a studio, and this lack of pressure showed up in the quality of the finished album. It was full of songs with devastatingly dark but beautiful lyrics over memorable melodies. This often sounds like traditional country if you're looking just at the musical elements. It's not gimmicky or especially over the top even. It's genuine Americana that just happens to be quite colorful, with those colors often being pitch black or blood red. I mentioned Through the Trees, but I'd strongly recommend the run of 4 albums starting with that one. In the Air, Twilight, and Singing Bones are all high watermarks in dark Americana. And for the final band, let's stretch things a little bit further. Wayfarer is a band I've been very into since discovering their most recent album, American Gothic. They make a blend of atmospheric black metal with country and western elements. They formed in Denver, Colorado, naturally, back in 2011. Their first couple albums were an atmospheric black metal that was evocative of nature in a way that reminds me a little bit of Agalloch. By their third album, World's Blood, the sound of the West was making its way into their work, along with a more experimental black metal sound like you might find in bands like Neurosis or Isis. Their most recent 2 albums are my favorites, 2020's A Romance with Violence and 2023's American Gothic. With both of these, they've achieved a wonderful balance of their atmospheric experimental black metal, full of imagery reflecting the Western Gothic tradition. This is reflected in their badass song titles like Reaper of the Oil Fields, The Thousand Tombs of Western Promise, and their two-act epic, Gallows Frontier. If you aren't generally a fan of metal, but you're open to heavy music, I would actually say American Gothic is a fairly accessible entry point into modern black metal. So we've gone from some of the influences to the development of this sort of genre, to the development of a real scene in the 80s and the 90s, to some bands that are playing now within this genre space. If you watch this one, I truly appreciate you, because I know this is pretty far outside the bounds of the genres I usually cover on this channel. Also, can I just say, this one was a real bitch to write. I feel like I wrote about twice of what actually ended up making it into the script, because I just kept going in digressions about different folk songs, and Bobby Gentry's Ode to Billy Joe got like a page and a half of dissection. I don't know what I'm gonna do with all that writing. Maybe it's gonna be another Gothic folk video down the road. Let me know if you'd like to see that. Maybe I'll just save it for Halloween next year. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark side of country music, please subscribe, give me a like, and I'm also active on Instagram. Thanks for watching Eclecticism, and I'll see you next time.